What is it? I'm Mr. Beat. At this point, I've managed to accomplish making a lot of videos about all of the American presidents. I've made videos about their pets, their kids, their wealth, their religion, their education, even their favorite food and music. But one thing I haven't accomplished yet is just straight up looking at their accomplishments. What did they get done while in office that had the greatest impact? Well, in this video, we are going to look at the biggest accomplishment of every American president while they were in office. But first, here's a word from our sponsor. What is it? Mr. Beat, I am. The fastest growing crime in the United States is identity theft. Most of you didn't guess that, did you? In fact, there's a new victim of it every 14 seconds. Well, this video is sponsored in part by Aura. Aura is identity theft protection, fraud monitoring, a VPN, password management, and antivirus software all combined into one easy-to-use app. Aura scans the dark web for your emails, passwords, and social security numbers and sends alerts fast, right to your phone in email. And guess what? Aura found my personal information on the dark web 31 times. 31 times! Holy crap. Protect you and your family from the country's fastest growing crime. Try out Aura for free for 2 weeks by going to the special link in the description of this video. Try it out like I did to see if your personal information or your family's personal information has been compromised. Maybe it's out there like mine was on the dark web. Goodness. All right, back at it, lad. You remember what this video is all about, Precious, don't you? It's about the biggest accomplishment of every American president while they were in office. But what does biggest accomplishment mean? Well, it basically just means the one thing they did while they were in office that had the greatest positive impact on the greatest number of people. And when I say, quote, greatest positive impact on the greatest number of people, I say it with my historian hat on, looking at all of American history. Now, it has to be something they accomplished while in office, so sorry, William Henry Harrison. Jeez, what am I gonna say for William Henry Harrison? Bruh.
Oh yeah?
Ah!
What are you gonna say about Andrew Johnson?
Oh, hey, Mr. Terry. What was that?
Oh, hey, Mr. Beat. Sorry, I thought you knew I was watching you. So what are you gonna say about Andrew Johnson?
Oh, geez. What am I gonna say for Andrew Johnson? Well, you'll all just have to find out, okay? Well, feel free to jump in if you disagree with me on any of these, okay?
Are you sure? I kind of feel bad for interrupting you already.
Oh, don't feel bad. I only peed my pants a little bit. Seriously, though, my audience would love to hear your expertise on this. So, right, audience? Eh?
Right on. Let's do this.
Here is the biggest accomplishment for every American president in history while they were in office, in my opinion.
And in my opinion, too.
Yes, of course, in our opinion. Curtain, please. Curtain. George Washington. The greatest accomplishment of Washington was making it clear what the role of the president was. Sure, the US Constitution laid it all out, but you know how people can interpret that differently and stuff. Washington made it clear that he, as president, was not only the head of state, but also the commander-in-chief in charge of all the armed forces. Not just the armed forces, in fact. He was also in charge of all of the executive branch. Additionally, while he couldn't pass new laws, he certainly influenced Congress into passing new laws, as well as vetoing two he didn't like. Washington also made sure the president, as head of state, was the lead spokesperson for the entire country. Even more specifically, though, the greatest thing that he did while in office was quit. Yep. He made it clear that he didn't want to be a king. and he voluntarily resigned or retired at the end of his second term, and thus set a standard for all future American presidents who came after him. John Adams. Although there's a strong case to make that appointing John Marshall to the Supreme Court was the most impactful positive thing Adams did while president, I'm actually going to go with the Convention of 1800 instead, which ended the quasi-war and healed relations between the United States and France. In fact, without John Adams' biggest accomplishment, Thomas Jefferson's biggest accomplishment wouldn't even exist. Thomas Jefferson. You probably already guessed this one, but Jefferson's biggest accomplishment was the Louisiana Purchase. As unconstitutional as it maybe was, for just $15 million, Jefferson was able to nearly double the size of the country and dramatically increased the country's power over the continent. While it had a positive impact long-term for many Americans, it is also important to recognize that it came at a great cost for tens of thousands of Native Americans. James Madison. Madison's significance to the United States is much greater as a founding father, but as president, he honestly didn't have that many accomplishments. Still, holding Great Britain back during the War of 1812 easily is his biggest accomplishment in my opinion. The Americans were huge underdogs in that war, and surviving the British threat indeed felt like a second war of independence and led to sweeping patriotism and unity across the country.
Whoa. What about James Madison being the chief author of the Constitution? That's gotta be worth something.
Well, that was way before he was president.
Also, being the shortest president ever at 5'4", that's an accomplishment?
Yeah, he was short. James Monroe. Well, Monroe did sign the Missouri Compromise, which held the country together despite its differences over slavery for the next 30 years, but I think Monroe's biggest accomplishment was no law he signed, but just a bunch of words he said. The Monroe Doctrine, baby! The Monroe Doctrine was basically a set of foreign policy principles that said that any intervention in the political affairs of the Americas for foreign powers, okay, mostly Europe, would be seen as a hostile act. In other words, you mess with me and my neighbors to the south, we will come after you, my friend. Most historians say the Monroe Doctrine is a defining moment in the history of American foreign policy, and it would heavily influence the foreign policy of many presidents who came after him.
So his greatest achievement is intimidating foreign countries. How American?
How American indeed. John Quincy Adams. Infrastructure, FTW. Adams was greatly influential through his ambitious infrastructure projects to keep the country connected, in particular presiding over big repairs and further construction on the National Road and the creation of a bunch of new canals. Andrew Jackson. Jackson is the only president in American history to pay off the national debt. When he first took office, the national debt was $58 million. 6 years later, he was able to limit the spending of Congress so much that it was down to zero, and there was a surplus. So what did Jackson do with all the extra money that came in? Well, he divided it evenly between the states, of course. Martin Van Buren. Van Buren helped in the Aroostook War between settlers of Maine and New Brunswick. Bet you didn't know that, did you? Huh?
And those mutton chops.
William Henry Harrison. Oh, geez. Here it is. Well, his biggest accomplishment as president for those 31 days was his great inauguration speech, the one in which he famously wore no coat and spoke longer than any other president at their inauguration in history. Oh, I know! Appointing Daniel Webster as Secretary of State. That was an excellent choice. Woo! John Tyler. I would say Tyler's biggest accomplishment was the annexation of Texas. He was a big reason why Texas joined the United States. And remember, it was an independent country at the time it did so. A shout out to Tyler, Texas, by the way, a city named to honor him. James Polk. While I don't entirely approve of how he did it. Overall, Polk's biggest accomplishment was acquiring more territory for the United States than any other president in history. Kind of a big deal. First, through carrying out the annexation of Texas. Next, through aggressively getting the United States involved in a war with Mexico that got the country all of this out here. And finally, negotiating a treaty with Great Britain to secure Oregon territory. Sea to shining sea indeed.
Polk was also the subject of They Might Be Giants' most underappreciated song.
Well, I mean, I wrote a song about Polk too, you know. I wrote a song about all the presidents. Zachary Taylor. I would argue that Taylor's biggest accomplishment was making sure California would be admitted to the Union as a free state. Although he was a slave owner himself, he was against the expansion of slavery out west. And as more and more Southerners threatened to leave the Union over the issue of slavery, he increasingly sided with the anti-slavery Northerners during his presidency. Because of him, California skipped over becoming a federal territory because he knew otherwise Congress would just endlessly fight about whether or not slavery should be legal there. Millard Fillmore. Fillmore and his Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, organized and sent out the Perry Expedition, which opened relations between Japan and the outside world. The expedition ultimately led to an end to Japan's 220-year-old policy of isolation. Not only did it lead to diplomatic relations between Japan and the United States, but it also led to diplomatic relations with Japan and most of Europe. Franklin Pierce. How about the Gadsden Purchase?
Why haven't you done any jokes about the Gadsden Purchase?
Pierce arranged for it to be bought from Mexico for a fairly cheap price, and it provided a great strip of land to build a transcontinental railroad while also resolving border disputes that had been ongoing.
You gotta be able to laugh at the Gadsden Purchase. I mean, it's what life's all about.
Maybe that's what your life's about, but I don't see what's so funny about a 150-year-old land treaty.
Just look at all the comedic possibilities. I mean, you got Franklin Pierce, hello, James Gadsden, not to mention topographical issues regarding the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. I mean, the jokes practically write themselves.
Today, 1.8 million Americans live in that area, and it remains an important part of the country. Although I must give a shout out to Pierce for aggressively lowering tariffs and thus lowering the cost of doing business and making stuff cheaper for consumers. James Buchanan. There weren't many accomplishments, but I think Buchanan's biggest was establishing more federal control over Utah territory in what became known as the Utah War. I still think Brigham Young was the worst governor in American history, and it was ultimately a good thing that Buchanan got him out of there.
And Buchanan was the only president not to be married. That's gotta be an accomplishment, right?
That's definitely an accomplishment. I love Mrs. B. Abraham Lincoln. Keeping the country together? Hello? In addition to preserving the Union with his leadership during the Civil War, I'd say Lincoln's biggest accomplishment was ending slavery. First, with his Emancipation Proclamation, and second, with everything he was able to do behind the scenes to get the 13th Amendment passed, as seen in the wonderful film named The 13th Amendment. Lincoln.
Hey, Lincoln also accomplished being the tallest president at 6'4", without the hat even. Oh, and he's in the Wrestling Hall of Fame.
Fun facts. Andrew Johnson. Again, not many accomplishments during Johnson's presidency either. But I suppose give him credit for the purchase of Alaska from Russia. In my opinion, it was another great bargain that benefited the United States long term. Ulysses Grant. Grant actually had quite a bit of accomplishments while he was president, but I say his efforts to help African Americans remain at the top. His push for the passing of the 15th Amendment, his signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and his success hunting down and prosecuting members of the KKK during Reconstruction make him one of the strongest allies of African Americans during the 1800s. Rutherford Hayes. Hayes' biggest accomplishment was getting the ball rolling with civil service reform. Instead of giving federal jobs to his political supporters, he had a policy of giving them jobs based on whether or not they were, wait for it now, qualified. And when Congress was slow to act on civil service reform, Hayes issued an executive order that prohibited federal office holders from having to make campaign contributions or being politically active in order to work in the federal government. James Garfield. He was only in office for a few months, but still, he took what Hayes did with civil service reform and cranked it up to 11. Even though it became a law after his assassination, I'd argue the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act was mostly because of him. Chester Arthur. Arthur is a big reason why the United States Navy became a lot stronger. Since the Civil War, American naval power had dramatically declined. But Arthur almost single-handedly reversed that trend. Grover Cleveland. I think Cleveland's biggest accomplishment was related to not what he did do, but what he didn't do. He weakened the power of the presidency. I think that's a good thing. Time and time again throughout his presidency, when many called for him to act, he essentially responded by saying the Constitution didn't allow him to do so. As commander-in-chief, when imperialists wanted him to take over Hawaii and Cuba, he resisted. I think this constraint is noble, and you just don't see it with very many American presidents. Benjamin Harrison. Hands down, Harrison's biggest accomplishment was signing the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was the first big law to fight trusts, monopolies, and cartels in order to increase economic competitiveness. William McKinley. Many don't realize this, but McKinley set the stage for the Panama Canal existing. He was very hands-on in the planning process, even though it wouldn't be completed until 13 years after his death. Theodore Roosevelt. There were so many big accomplishments during Teddy's presidency, but I'll go with his influence and signing of both the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Together, those laws have been extremely influential, protecting us as consumers.
He rode a moose.
That he did. William Taft. While Roosevelt is known as the trust-buster president, Taft nearly doubled the number of antitrust lawsuits of Roosevelt, and he did that in just one term. Also, a shout out to his dollar diplomacy foreign policy, which sought to expand American influence overseas, not through military force, but through economic incentives.
He was so fat he got stuck in a bathtub.
Poor William Howard Taft, always with the memes with the bathtub. Woodrow Wilson. I'm a big fan of Wilson's 14 points, a list of principles he created to influence peace negotiations at the end of World War I. They promoted stuff like free trade, open agreements, democracy around the world, and something known as self-determination, which means people around the world ought to determine who rules over them. Basically, Wilson promoting self-determination was him strongly rejecting imperialism, even though some folks laughed at Wilson's 14 points at the time, calling them too, quote, idealistic. Today, they are mainstream ideals, which ultimately are a big reason why the United Nations exists.
All right. Real talk here. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points were a very good set of ideas. And if more of them had actually gone into the Treaty of Versailles, maybe no World War II.
Warren Harding. Harding signed the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, which created the country's first formal budgeting process and put the president in charge of budget planning. I'm sorry, Harding, that was kind of boring for you. Calvin Coolidge. I think Coolidge's biggest accomplishment was signing the Indian Citizenship Act, which recognized that any person born in the United States was a citizen. It was passed after, for years, courts had not recognized Native Americans as citizens and therefore not protected by the U.S. Constitution. Herbert Hoover. I just don't know. Hoover's not giving me much to work with, okay? I guess the 3 Supreme Court justices he nominated, Charles Evans Hughes, Owen Roberts, and Benjamin Cardozo, they were all pretty good, so kudos to that. Franklin Roosevelt. Obviously, FDR had so many big accomplishments, so it is really difficult for me to pick just one, but I guess I'll go with his signing of the Social Security Act, which created the Social Security program that so many Americans seem to take for granted today. Over time, it has led to a dramatic decline in poverty among the elderly. Overall, you can't deny his effective leadership during the Great Depression and World War II. He really did help us get through some dark times.
FDR's New Deal definitely changed Americans' relationship with their government. Really, before that, people didn't really expect aid from their government. But ever since the New Deal, people have come to expect it.
Harry Truman. The Marshall Plan, for real. The Truman administration transferred more than $115 billion in today's money to European countries devastated by World War II. Its goals were not only to rebuild war-torn regions, but also to remove trade barriers, modernize industry, restore European prosperity, and prevent the spread of communism. And I'd argue it was one of the most effective programs ever implemented by the United States government in history.
Here's something to think about. The Marshall Plan really helped economically rebuild Germany and Japan. Now, if the Marshall Plan hadn't taken place, would we have had a World War III?
Dwight Eisenhower. I think Eisenhower's biggest accomplishment was his massive role in the creation of the interstate highway system. I got a whole video here about the interstate highway system. If you want to learn more, you can watch it later, but stick around. We have more presidents to learn about here. What? You didn't know there were other presidents after Eisenhower? Didn't your mother ever tell you about the other presidents after Eisenhower? John F. Kennedy. Well, you could say avoiding World War III with his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I'll go with his civil rights efforts. Before his death, JFK proposed a huge civil rights bill that ultimately became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Oh, and a shout out to the Peace Corps, which JFK established. It's a wonderful program that really helps so many people out. Lyndon Johnson. LBJ also got a lot done while he was president, especially with civil rights, but I'm gonna go with him signing the Social Security Amendments of 1965, which created both Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is a health insurance program that provides cheap coverage for the elderly, while Medicare is a health insurance program that provides cheap coverage for those with lower income. Both programs have helped tens of millions of Americans have access to quality health care who otherwise would not have access. Both programs have also led to healthcare innovation and increased medical standards. Richard Nixon. Nixon's policy of détente, or a more flexible policy of negotiation to ease relations with both the Soviet Union and China during the Cold War, was brilliant. I actually think it was the most effective thing any president had done up to that point to set the stage for the Cold War coming to an end. Also, did you know that all the moon landings happened when Nixon was in office? I always forget about that.
Now, whether you like the way it ended or not, it is notable that America's involvement in Vietnam ended under Nixon.
True. Gerald Ford. How about the Privacy Act of 1974? Ford signed that. It's one of the few laws in American history that even attempts to protect the personal records of Americans from being exploited by the government. Jimmy Carter. I'd say the biggest accomplishment of Carter while he was president is something usually attributed to his successor, Ronald Reagan, the deregulation of several industries. With Carter signing of the Airline Deregulation Act, the Motor Carrier Act, the Staggers Rail Act, and the Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act, he helped make markets become more competitive than arguably most presidents before him. Say what? Ronald Reagan.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Reagan's biggest accomplishment was convincing the world that the Soviet Union was a failed state, and he indeed was a big influence on the fall of the Soviet Union. You can't deny that. His relationship with the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was particularly an instrumental part of this. George H.W. Bush. Although you could say the Gulf War was quite a smashing success as far as wars go, I hate to say a war is his biggest accomplishment. So I'll go with Bush's signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which has led to dramatic improvements regarding access and accommodations to public services and facilities for those with disabilities. This is another law we greatly take for granted today. Bill Clinton. Well, let's keep the laws we take for granted today theme going here with the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993. Bill Clinton signed that. Well, he did. It makes it so that employers have to provide employees with job-protected, unpaid leave for certain medical and family reasons. In other words, you can't get fired for taking time off to take care of your sick mother, for example. George W. Bush. As many mistakes as Bush Jr. made throughout his presidency, I've never denied that he was a good leader. He was. So his biggest accomplishment? Keeping the country united, determined, focused, and even hopeful after the horrific 9/11 attacks. Sure, things went chaotic and divisive once he made the decision to invade Iraq, but before that, Bush's leadership regarding going after suspected terrorists around the world was phenomenal. Barack Obama. Obamacare, duh. Obama spearheaded and signed the law, named after him, but also known as the Affordable Care Act, which dramatically increased the amount of Americans who had health insurance. While the law was far from perfect, most Americans have appreciated it since it has made it so that health insurance is more affordable to lower income families and made it so that health insurance must cover them regardless of pre-existing conditions. I recently learned that there is some evidence that Obamacare has actually helped reduce healthcare costs overall, although the Heritage Foundation found the opposite to be true, so I don't know. The Heritage Foundation, you love them, don't you?
Thanks, Obama.
Donald Trump. Trump's biggest accomplishment was his signing of the First Step Act, one of the biggest criminal justice reform laws in American history. It reformed federal prisons and reversed harsh sentencing laws and basically just made it less likely for folks to go to federal prison for stupid stuff. Joe Biden. Well, he's only been in office for a year and a half at this point, but I'd say his biggest accomplishment, at least so far, is bringing the troops home from Afghanistan. Now, how it went was obviously a disaster, but at least he had the courage to do it. Remember though, it's extremely difficult to not be biased one way or the other regarding whoever the current president in office is. And I'm sure one day my opinion will change, of course. So there it is. There was the biggest accomplishment of every American president while they were in office. Thanks to Mr. Terry for hopping in from time to time in this video, and make sure you subscribe to his channel if you haven't already. It was nice to have him disagree with me on some of these. I enjoy it when people disagree with me. It gives me an opportunity to change my mind, and I've changed my mind many, many times throughout my life. In fact, as big an accomplishment it was to make this video, I'm probably gonna end up remaking it someday because I disagree with myself in the past all the time. So. Still, what an accomplishment this was, making this video. Pat myself on the back, but give yourself a pat on the back as well. You accomplished watching this video. And now it's time for my monthly shout out to all my Patreon supporters who donate at least $15 or more each month to my channel. I value them highly. I'm going to give them a shout out alphabetically, starting with my biggest donors. Thank you, Bill Dowd, Adam Lucky, Alicia Solberg, Andrew B., Anthony Beckett, Asif Ismail, Austin Siros, Corey Ryman, Dr. Paul J. Lilly, Empty Machine, Kyle Fassbinder, Matt Standish, Neo R14, Nick Everett, Noah Hoff, Osbers Gaming, Owen, Pat Iapicca, Sean Connett, William Roush, Adam Christians, Alex Gorel, Andrew Snyder, Carmen, Gail Gerard, Grant Hughes, Ian Driscoll, Elon Capone, Jack L., Jacob Birnbaum, Joe Serrano Lozada, Kit Walker, Naderade, Nelson Guzman, Omar Arizona, Samuel Striz, Society's Basement, Stacy, Steve Bryan, Thomas Oppenheim, Warren Girard, Waterfort, and Zachary F. Parker. Thank you to all my Patreon supporters, and thank you for watching. What an accomplishment.